So hello and welcome. This is great. It's exciting. My name is Atul Sapra. I'm a senior manager with RSM. I won't do the full plug on our firm, but we're an international accounting and consulting firm, 120 countries. We have a significant amount of back and forth trade or business with India. We have an India desk. Mukesh, are you here? There he is, our India desk. Somebody asked me if there's a guy with a chair. That's him. But anyway, I've been asked to moderate this panel. We have two really esteemed speakers and handle the rowdy crowd as well. So a format simply is going to be a Q&A. Start off questions here. And towards the last 10 minutes, we'll have a Q&A. But I've been told there's no mic in the audience, so please speak loudly. I'll repeat your question, and you're welcome to direct the question to wherever you'd like to speak. So the point of this panel, quite simply, is to talk about India not as a single market, but to address the fact that India is many things, many regions, many cities, and many urban centers, and needs to be thought strategically as more than just one. So Nisha, you had a chance to speak and tell us a little bit about yourself. Gunjan, could you also elaborate about yourself and tell us who you are, why you're here, and so forth?
Sure. My name is Gunjan Bagla, and I run a boutique management consulting firm called Amrit. Amrit helps US companies to do business in India. Our clients range from large entities in the defense and aerospace business, such as Boeing, to Clorox in the consumer product business, to DigiKey, which is one of the largest electronics distributors in the world, to companies that make hair color and rugs and you name it. We've been doing this for 15 years, and if you had asked me 15 years ago that we would be where we are today in US-India trade, I would have said you're crazy. Okay, so it's been a tremendous growth path, and I think we've just started to see the beginnings of the potential of this relationship. So it's a very exciting time.
Great, thank you, Gunjan. So the easy softball question. Nisha, we'll start off with you. Is it true you shouldn't have one India strategy? India's more complicated than that?
Well, certainly what the Indian government is seeking to do by creating a national goods and services tax is to create a common market. But India is much more complex than a unified common market, and you do need a diversified strategy for how you engage that market. You see that in the fact that they're creating a very competitive index of state progress. Different states have different investment policies and climates, and so the ease of doing business, while there's a national index that the World Bank puts out on the ease of doing business, and India has been steadily improving on that, particularly over the last 2 years, where it's made some important strides. The more telling indices are the state competitive index, where you can see which states are really making it easy and attractive to invest and do business.
So that begs the question of what states, what regions, what cities? Could you highlight a few maybe that you see as positive for direct investment?
Sure. I mean, I think that, the states that have consistently been up there have been Gujarat, certainly during the time and tenure of Narendra Modi's chief ministership, but also has continued to be strong. Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, and Telangana have been very strong. And then you're starting to see more and more states that are vying for this, where in the past you would see India almost distancing itself from these kinds of competitive indices, saying, oh, we don't believe in them, they're weighted against us, we don't compete, we have our own measures. Now they're actively competing to show their own progress. And so I think you're starting to see the inflows of investment are having the desired effect of creating a virtuous competition to try to draw that investment in.
Okay. Gunjan, the same question for you as well. Is a One India strategy, or is it also, as we're talking about, much more diversified and much more regional? And if so, also, what areas and what regions would you recommend as starting points?
Okay. So let me actually say something else first. Today is a very special day. Today marks the triumph of good over evil, right? No, I'm not talking about what you're thinking about. Although that's true as well.
This is apolitical, please.
I'm talking about Diwali, the festival of lights.
Good. Just clarifying that for the audience.
Okay. Yeah. So today it marks the, a big celebration in India. Today also marks the beginning of the financial year for many companies in India. And, being an accountant, I have to tell you, I have to point that out, right? Yeah. So it's actually very auspicious that we are having this conference on Diwali Day. So let me start first by saying what is not different about different parts of India, okay? So first of all, if you are an American company and you want to incorporate in India, it doesn't matter which state you incorporate in, okay? Whereas a foreign company coming here has to wonder, oh, do I do a Delaware corporation, or am I doing something fishy so I go to Nevada, or do I really want to incorporate in California? In India it doesn't matter, People say India is a hard place to do business. Yes, in many ways it is, but in some ways it's actually an easier place to do business. A second thing that I think unifies all of India, and those of us who have traveled to India, now how many of you have been to India on business in the last year or so? Okay, so a fair number of you, right? So you know that in America we call a spade, right? We want to be as direct and as blunt as possible. And those of you who do business in India know that most of India functions in an indirect manner. You never call a spade a spade. In fact, people consider you unsophisticated, if you do that. So that's a common trait, I think, across all the 29 states. And the third and most visible thing for most Americans traveling to India for the first time is that traffic is terrible everywhere and is not getting better. Okay.
We're in Los Angeles, you realize that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But India is, you can get run over on the sidewalk in India. Yeah.
Traffic moves fast enough?
Yeah. So now, how are things different? Okay, yes, Nisha pointed out the differences between the states as far as the doing business index is concerned, and as far as some of the states that are doing very well. Gujarat probably in 10 years will be like a first world country. Okay, and Nisha, your origin is from Gujarat, so you have special appreciation of that state. I've been there many, many times. Some of our clients do business there. But really it comes down to, when you, as Willie Sutton said, why do you rob banks? You go where the money is, right? And so if you're going to go to India, you want to go to where the customer is, if you're selling products or services into India. And so, yeah, sometimes the customer may not be in Gujarat. And then, if you go to Gujarat, maybe it's not the right place, right? If you are sourcing from India, again, you want to go to where the capabilities are, where the manufacturing centers are, where the logistics is suitable, okay? So I'll give you some examples of clients that we have taken to states other than Gujarat. I love Gujarat, nothing wrong with it. Maharashtra is great too, so is Andhra and so on, all the states that rank highly on the Doing Business Index. But we took a client that's in the textiles business. They make rugs out of synthetic yarn.
It's a U.S. company, correct?
It's a U.S. company, yes. We work primarily with U.S. companies. So we took them to Jaipur, and we took them to two cities that many of you may never have heard of, Bhadoi and Mirzapur in UP, which hardly ever ranks high on the Doing Business Index. But it turns out that they looked at Jaipur and they looked at Bhadoi and Mirzapur and decided that that's where they wanted to get their rugs woven because the skills were there. So it made sense. Give you another example. One of our clients makes hair color, and they wanted to produce in India, and we took them to two locations. One was in Uttarakhand, which is a mountain state, in the town of Roorkee, and the other place that we took them was Himachal Pradesh in the town of Baddi, which is on a very steep hillside. But the manufacturers there were far superior to anything that we could find for them anywhere else. So the reason we went there is not because these are great places to do business per se, but because these are appropriate for the client.
So what I'm hearing, and that makes sense to me as well, so maybe we should be more nuanced. There shouldn't just be states, regions, urban centers, but functions, skill sets, more nuanced like that. Nisha, do you agree? I'm assuming that's very practical and makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, depending on what your industry is or what your market is that you're trying to look for, and what the infrastructure is in a state that's going to allow you to access in the most efficient way possible. And the other challenge is that, you know, there are increasingly U.S. companies that are actually looking to access the unified market, right? They're looking to be able to put their products across the totality of that Indian market, whether it's a consumer goods company or whether it's a B2B company, but they're looking at the larger. And so that's also something that I think is starting to slowly emerge, is the India that you can access as a common market.
So that's curious, though. For your example of the consumer products company trying to enter the Indian market, what would the thought process look like then? Like, how would they, I mean, I know we're talking about both, you mentioned a unified market, but we're also talking about kind of a subnational strategy, right? So what would the thought process be if someone came to you and said, hey, Nisha, I'd like to enter the Indian markets, consumer products, eventually starting off in a region, then spreading? What would you be step one, step two, step three?
I mean, you're looking at where your partnerships are, your joint venture partner, who's your India partner, and the due diligence that you put into finding the partner and finding out where their strength is, and so you go in through that, and then you expand out, right? But increasingly, you see American companies and the global, the global industry is looking at India and looking at India as the fastest growing large market across virtually every sector. Whether you're looking at consumer products, or you're looking at the hospitality industry, or the medical services industry, or energy, across the board. Financial services, India represents probably the fastest growing, largest market and opportunity for growth globally.
So you said something quite interesting to me about an India partner. Is that, regulatory reasons aside, do you think that's a mandatory item, or a maybe, or like good to have? Is it necessary? Can you go it alone?
I mean, you are now seeing FDI caps in India being raised across many, many sectors. And so there are certainly opportunities where you can go in without an Indian partner, but the ability to effectively navigate that system, to navigate the regulatory, to navigate the cultural space, I think the ability to be effective requires you to have a really good, effective local partner, or invest in a very significant local capacity.
Okay. That's interesting, because I know a lot of the requests that we get actually is, well, we're 120 countries, there's RSM India, 14 offices. So often when people ask us, hey, I'd like to enter the Indian market, we ask them where they'd like to go, what sort of industry they're planning to go into. But the focus often is where, and then we pick up the phone, talk to someone in RSM India. So it seems to me that a lot of times the professional services people there, the accountants, lawyers, bankers, can provide a lot of the advice. But you're saying that an actual business partner is what they need, likely.
In many instances.
Many instances, okay. Gunjan, do you agree with that, or?
So again, it's hard to paint India with a single brush, but let me give you examples of companies that have chosen not to have a partner at all, right? Boeing doesn't have a joint venture partner in India, right? Coca-Cola doesn't have a joint venture partner in India anymore, right? McDonald's is dissolving some of its partnerships in India. For us, when we look at a client going to India, the first thing we want to understand is, can they go it alone? Does it make sense for them to go it alone? Okay. Many companies are coming to India having been conditioned by an entry into China in the last 15 or 20 years. And they somehow think that India is China 2.0. Okay, and nothing, of course, people in this room know nothing could be further from the truth. The way to make a fool of yourself is to think that India is like China. Okay, and in China, because most of the companies have some connection or the other with the government or the Communist Party or whatever, you'd better have a Chinese partner. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in all kinds of strange and interesting trouble. Right? That's not the case in India. Right? That's not the case at all in India. So there are many, many companies that are successful without any joint venture partnership, investment, and so on. Okay, now that doesn't mean that that makes sense for everybody. Right? right? So sometimes you want a distribution partner, sometimes you want some other kind of partnership. I think what's really important is you must take the time to understand India with humility. And the joint venture partner can provide that. A trusted advisor can provide that. You can send some of your employees, whether they are Indian American or not, it doesn't make any difference. I have seen Americans who have never lived in India go there and become extremely successful. I've seen Indian Americans go there and fall flat on their face. Okay? In fact, in some ways, it's harder for an Indian American to go to India than it is for a humble, listening, caring American to go there, because they can act like, hey, I don't know, help me, educate me. Okay? Whereas an Indian American can sometimes have trouble with that. So yeah, there's many ways to get educated about India, as long as you have that education and you're willing to learn from your mistakes and take small steps at a time, you can do fine.
So one thing you said, though, but the examples you started off with were Coca-Cola, right? McDonald's, Boeing, these are big companies. What about smaller size? Am I right in thinking smaller? What size and what sophistication can a U.S. company enter the Indian marketplace? And maybe at what level do they have to, can they do it alone?
So there's many ways to answer that.
I know.
Our smallest client has been one employee. So as long as they have a bank account with a check big enough to hire us, I guess we can consider them. But I'm being facetious when I say that. You really want to look at the size of the market and the risk they're taking. Okay, some people get glamour, fall into a love affair with India. And I asked them, are you in Mexico yet? No. Are you in Canada yet? No. Why on earth do you want to go on the other side of the planet first? Is there some specific reason? If you have something that ties into the mobile 4G technology, yeah, maybe. Okay. But other than that, you should venture into nearby markets, find out what it is to do international business before you go 10 to 12 time zones away. Right? But beyond that, really, we have many companies that have 10 or 15 employees that are doing reasonably well in India. We are currently helping an Israeli startup that is launching in India, Europe, and the United States at the same time. They have a device that will deal with mouth cancer. And so there's a huge need for that in India, given the tobacco consumption and pan consumption and so on. So they're brave enough to take that leap very, very early. And that, for them, it makes sense. But my first conversation with them was to discourage them. Why are you doing that? Deal with Europe. There's big money there. And they said, no, we are really committed to wanting to do this in India.
That's interesting. Nisha, what do you think about that? I think that makes sense to me that you have to have a good reason. You can't just be enamored with India. A lot of our clients, frankly, are in the U.S., they're in Canada, they're wandering into Mexico, they get a little scared. But I've had plenty of clients go out and make an acquisition of many companies and say, we don't want the Indian piece. We don't know what to do with that piece. We're afraid of going into India. So do you need a good reason?
So I take a little bit of a different tactic. And admittedly, most of the companies that we work with are larger companies, but increasingly more mid-caps and SMEs are also becoming more and more interested on the India opportunity. And what I say is India is challenging, it is complicated, but it is worth trying to navigate that complexity. Because if our companies wait too long just dipping the toe in the water, testing the water, trying to wait and see if the water's warm enough and comfortable enough for them to dive in, by the time they think that the water is warm enough, guess what? The pool's going to be so crowded that you can't really So the time to really start looking at India, thinking about India, and building your India comfort is now. It was, frankly, yesterday. Because India is going to continue to move forward, right? It is going to continue, it is going to continue to open up and become an easier environment. But it's easier to shape that environment from within than to wait on the outside. And there are plenty of companies, like Gunjan's, that are there to kind of help smaller companies navigate that. The largest exporter of movie house popcorn to Indian cinemas is a small company out of Nebraska. Products will find their markets. Services will find their markets. And India has a massive movie-going population. So why not think about how do you get movie house popcorn into India, right? And kudos to that Nebraska company that saw that opportunity and built that relationship and created those links and started down that path. And I think that that's what I would say to folks is that there is a market waiting for you. There is an opportunity waiting for you. There is a partner waiting for you. And India is on a growth trajectory. I want to see American companies being at the heart of India's growth. I want to see American businesses intertwined with, as you know, another statistic that I say is 80% of the India of 2030 has yet to be built. That gives you a sense of what the infrastructure boom in India is going to look like over the next decade. I want American companies to be part of that infrastructure boom. We have a lot of technology, we have a lot of capacity that can help. And the two countries, as we invest in each other, as we intertwine, are going to create opportunity in both directions.
That's great. I know to this point in time we've been talking about getting into the marketplace or getting into the marketplaces. Gunjan, what if you're already there? How do you know if you're doing the right things? How do you know if you're expanding into the right places, the next cities, region centers, or so forth? How do you evaluate that?
Yeah, so most American companies of any substance are built around specific business units. And just because one business unit is there doesn't mean that the rest of the company knows how to deal with India. I remember at one time Northrop Grumman had an office, a small office in Delhi. And across the hallway, there was another Northrop Grumman office from another business unit. Okay, because they were, because of US defense rules, one was supporting the F-16, the other was supporting the F-18, so they weren't supposed to talk to each other. Okay, so it's, sometimes when you are a large company going into a market like India, you can learn a little bit from your predecessors who've been there, but sometimes you need to evaluate it from scratch for your own business and your own objectives and purposes. So about 10 years ago, we were hired by a company called Reckitt Benckiser. Those of you who are from India will recognize the brand name Dettol, right? Reckitt Benckiser owns Dettol, and they had been in India 100 years. Okay, but a new division wanted to look at innovation from India, and they knew that their team in India wasn't really suitable to answer those kinds of questions. So they did an internal evaluation, and as part of that evaluation, they called us in to, to help them out, and that makes total sense. So it's like any other market. You want to learn from your mistakes, but then you want to do a fresh evaluation of where things stand. The other thing is India, as Nisha has alluded, is changing very fast. So just because you understood India market entry 10 years ago or 12 years ago, doesn't mean that you understand what it is today. It's very, very different. It has changed in so many dimensions. When I give executive workshops on doing business in India, and 10 or 12 years ago, I used to show a video of Indian airports and how scary they were for the first-time visitor. Right? Those videos.
I experienced those scary airports.
Exactly, and those those videos are meaningless now because you go into Mumbai airport and it's a modern airport just like anyone else in the world. So it's unremarkable. It's no point showing of that video anymore. Yeah, so things have changed and are going to continue to change, as Nisha said.
So that's great. So, but to the point that if you're already there and you're evaluating how you're doing, understood different business units, is a sign of success simply that you're making more money? Is that simply it?
Well, if you're running a business for profit, that's an important sign.
Agreed.
But there are other measures as well. Are you making an impact? Is the Indian consumer seeing your brand as something positive? Okay. Is the Indian government seeing you as friend or foe? Those are important. Nestle found out not so long ago, when they had the ban on their Maggi product, that whether the charges were real or not, it cost them hundreds of millions of dollars to have to withdraw the product. Partly because I think they weren't as well tuned with the things that Indian citizens and the Indian government cares about. Generally, American companies are much more smart about that because they have good PR teams. They take the time to understand. They understand corporate social responsibility well ahead of the government's needs. And so they don't have that kind of trouble. But those are all important things to evaluate.
But for the mid-sized or smaller business, though, in terms of, you mentioned the issue of the government involvement or government awareness of them. Is no news good news, or how does one evaluate what one's doing? So revenue, so how do you evaluate whether or not you're doing good by the government?
Nisha is probably
you should not
better.
expect trouble in that direction.
So, first of all, I think that there's been really significant uptick in corporate governance across India. And one of the aspects of the massive infusion of FDI, the FDI going into India has been, by and large, around investing in enterprises, right? It's not so much been on investing in infrastructure, it's been on investing in enterprises. And with so much, American investment going into Indian enterprises, with that has come a significant improvement, increase in corporate governance. And you're also seeing a improvement in the governance from the public sector, right? So I think that yes, there are still some of those leftovers, holdovers from the license Raj, the nightmare of endless checks, permits, inspections, et cetera, that companies are trying to, steer clear of where it's not entirely transparent. I think that is diminishing. I think you're starting to see both the governance of companies and the way in which regulators are regulating, that you're starting to see improvements in all of that. And transparency and a lot more reporting on all of those issues.
Okay. No, I mean, that's exactly the point. I mean, with every business enterprise, there are multiple stakeholders. So agreed, revenue is a good indicator of success, but also just being good by all the stakeholders. And
So let me also add, 15 years ago, if you were a mid-sized company and you wanted to enter India and you wanted to go and meet the Joint Secretary of Commerce, you wouldn't get the time of day. That is no longer the case. All across the country, bureaucrats and government officials are eager to meet companies from the United States and from anywhere really, if they have an interest in developing their business there. And it's also an equal interest whether you want to sell your product or to buy products or services. That's one other thing I think over and over I hear Indian government officials emphasize that they're really looking for bilateral trade. I think, and that's particularly important to emphasize with the current environment in Washington where trade seems to mean I sell to you and you can't sell me anything back, which, doesn't, anybody who understands economics 101 knows that doesn't go very far. So, these Section 301 duties that are being imposed on Chinese imports, I have actually producing some interesting good results for India because people are now looking for alternatives to China. And so, companies like yours and mine, I'm sure, are staying very busy as a result of that. But it's not the kind of business that we want to have. We'd much rather have fair and open trade. And the environment in India with the Indian government officials is that they want fair and open trade in both directions.
thank you.
But let's just, I think it's moving in the right direction. India has got some more work to do to be truly open. And I think trade liberalization is still on the agenda of things that need to be pushed forward rather than on the agenda of things that have been done, but positive movements.
No, that's fair enough, But I want to leave some time for the audience, the rowdy audience here, to ask some questions. Go ahead.
Yes, Ken Silverman, also in the U.S.-India space. Nisha, question for you. Can you talk about the legal system, legal framework, the degree to which contracts are easily entered into, contracts are adhered to, and then when things sometimes go south, how easy or difficult is it for a U.S. company to get equitable treatment and speedy treatment doing business in India?
Yeah, I think speedy is a word that's hard to associate with dispute resolution and arbitration in the Indian context, and that's the big challenge. I mean, it has a robust legal system, and generally the Indian courts, when they get around to issuing the verdict, tend to come out in the right place, and I think very few people will argue that the court system doesn't come out with a considered and credible outcome. The problem is the amount of time it takes to get something resolved through that system. And for businesses, it's that uncertainty, that limbo of not having a resolution, which I think is almost as bad as having a negative outcome. In some instances, probably is worse than having a negative outcome, because you can't move on. Your money's tied up and you can't move beyond it. So that's the big challenge. And that's one of the issues, is, are we seeing improvements in the sanctity of contracts? I think we are. Are we seeing speedy resolution of commercial disputes? I think that's where there are ways to go. And one of the reasons when I was in government why we pushed so hard to try to get into a bilateral investment treaty with India was to be able to create some framework for investments, including arbitration of commercial disputes. We weren't able to launch into BIT, as it's generally known, or a bilateral investment treaty, because the Indian model BIT and the US standard were poles apart. And so we don't have a BIT with India, so we don't have a framework to help guide us through a number of these issues. And so in India, it's still kind of on a case-by-case basis. Right now, I think the US Trade Representative's Office and the Indian Ministry of Commerce are trying to negotiate some, small package of issues that they want to try to get resolution on. And these are, again, just a bundling of 4 or 5 various disparate commercial disputes that they're trying to get resolved, all because we don't have an overarching trade agreement with India, we don't have an investment treaty with India, we don't have a real trade architecture. And if we're going to move our two countries in a direction where we're going to scale up two-way trade and investment to where the potential should be in a $2.5 trillion economy that's trying to move towards a $5 trillion economy, which is India, or the United States. I mean, our trade with China is in the 560, 600 billion, something in that range. So you can see how far we have to go with India, but these are the kinds of issues that keep us from getting there.
Thank you. More questions? Right here.
Hi, David Carl with GetGlobal. I wonder if you could speak to the linguistic fragmentation of the Indian marketplace and how U.S. companies deal with it. Is it just a question of in some parts of the country you reach consumers via Hindi and in other parts of the country you don't? Do Hindi-speaking consumers behave differently than non-Hindi-speaking consumers?
Should I take that?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, India is unified by many common factors, and it is divided by many, many factors. So, if you start looking at the divisions, you take a city like Mumbai, okay? Well, Marathi is the main language there, but probably there's more Gujarati speakers in Mumbai. And then you look at the subdivisions. You go to Matunga, and people speak Tamil there. You go to another part of Mumbai, and they speak a different dialect of Marathi and so on. So you can, depending on the kind of product or service you have, you could go segmenting by all of those linguistic divisions. But really, go and look at the products on the shelves in India. Typically, they have English labeling, right? And that serves as the common language that kind of unites the country. There are some products that are more traditional that may have regional language labeling as well. But really, it's the style of selling more than anything else that I think varies from region to region. And some of the variations are linguistic, others are really regional. Sometimes they're based on religion and religious practices. If you're in a consumer product business, the way you would sell to a Jain would be different from the way you would sell to a Muslim customer, for example. And India has 25 million Christians and 200 million Muslims, so you have to be aware of all of those different ways to classify and segment the population depending on the nature of your product. Take a company like Western Union. They've been very successful in India. They don't do any English language advertising. All their advertising is in regional languages. They even translated their logo into Indian languages, okay, because that's the path that they chose to use. Whereas, some other companies have chosen to stick with the American logos and American symbols and so on, and that has worked well for them. HP or Dell, for example, don't need to do that. Does that answer your question?
Additional questions? Oh, back there?
Peter Kovacs from CPU Savvy. A question on the human side. You have touched that differences like versus direct and indirect, for example. I was wondering, what's the importance of developing the ability to be able to relate across cultures for somebody coming from here to India to be able to develop perhaps relationships and to be successful?
Nisha, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that approaching it from the perspective of trying to understand the cultural context is important. I think you are seeing Indian business leaders, corporate executives, increasingly becoming more and more savvy on global culture and practice of business. I mean, so many Indian corporate leaders are educated in elite institutions, either in India or in the United States or UK or Australia or whatnot. So, so you're seeing a little bit of a standardization of corporate culture. On the other hand, you do need to try to relate to and navigate and understand the local culture. And it's going to vary depending on the kind of business you're in and the kind of counterparts you're interacting with.
Let me add to that. So, companies don't do business with companies. It's really individuals do business with individuals. Even if you are Lockheed Martin selling a C-130 aircraft, if the Indian buyer hates you, it's going to be very, very hard, to conclude a contract. So I think developing those relationships, developing that humility to understand the other culture is crucial for success in any country, and particularly so, I think, in India. And I think for American companies, it's especially important because given the China experience, when they go to China, they'll always have a translator, interpreter, whatever. They go to India, and just because their counterpart speaks English, they get into this illusion that they actually understand what's going on, okay? And that's, I've had so many occasions where an Indian counterpart will tell me stories about what happened, when an American salesperson showed up in their office. And, maybe we can talk about that over the reception, because some of those are pretty scary, okay? Yeah, so it's really important to have that human relationship, I think.
One question back there.
Hi, Daniel Claire, Funderburg School of Global Management. So we have been talking a lot about the American relationship with India. Is there anything we can learn from our competitor, like European Union or China, things that we wish we could do that maybe we can't due to either the political system or the fact that in the U.S. we have a very different mindset about conducting business?
Nisha, do you want to address?
I think American businesses get a reputation of being very transactional and very wanting to see immediate, low on patience and very high on expectation. And that the Europeans have a reputation of being willing to be in it for the long game and investing much more effort into cultivating that relationship. I would hear from the Indians, for example, you talked about Lockheed Martin or Boeing. I would hear from the Indians, well, look, the Israelis are here all the time. They basically just, set up shop. And so they're constant, they're consistent. I think more and more American companies are developing that skill set and they're hiring the talent, whether it's local talent or bringing American, executives and basing them in India to develop those long-term. And virtually every one of my members that has a significant investment now has full-time India capabilities. They have large teams in place. That level of investment allows them to be credible, to develop trust, and to not be seen as short-termist or transactionalist. So it's taken us a while to get to that point. I think our European competitors probably got in earlier on that. On the other hand, we have, I think, an advantage in terms of the cutting-edge technology and know-how and best practices that the Indians and, frankly, the world want. So I don't think that we are at all, in that sense, out of the game, because I would say that we are the country and we are the industry that India wants to partner with. They want to draw our investment in. It is the most sought after, and therefore it is on us now to then be able to actually go in and take advantage of that.
Okay,
So-
I know we are out of time, but can I make
go ahead,
just one
yes, go
couple
ahead.
of quick points? So, some pro, some con. So one important thing to realize is that Europeans are sometimes more successful in India because they are not restrained by the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Okay? We in America have very tight rules on what we can and cannot do. And those are good rules. I think in the long run, they help us win. But in the short run, we do lose some business. Okay? The other aspect, I think, is that Europeans are used to much more diversity within their own continent. And so when they encounter a strange person in India, it doesn't seem that strange to them. Okay? The best way that this was put was really by the former CEO of Coca-Cola, who said, for us to succeed in India, we really needed to understand India on its own terms, not what we wish it to be. Okay? And I cannot tell you how many times I get this question from my American clients, saying, when will India ... If you start with, when will India change its rules? When will India become, a modern retail market? When will India do blah, blah, blah? That's the wrong question. You can't go into a country saying, you change so that I can sell to you, And, you very seldom hear that from Europeans. Okay? So again, it comes down to humility. It comes down to understanding diversity.
And that's a great way to end the session here. So afterwards, will you both be here for the remainder of the day? Do you do tweeting? Do you social media stuff as well? Can we follow you? Great. Thank you all.